We should be more like Scandinavia. You've heard it 1,000 times. Bernie Sanders says it. AOC says it. Your college professor says it. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, they've figured out democratic socialism, and America should follow their lead. Free healthcare, free education, strong unions, high wages, low poverty. It's proof that socialism works, except there's one problem. Scandinavia isn't socialist. It never was. And the former Prime Minister of Denmark is sick of Americans calling his country socialist. In 2015, Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen visited Harvard, and he said this: I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Let me say that again. The Prime Minister of Denmark, the country American socialists constantly point to as their model, explicitly stated that Denmark is not socialist. It's a market economy. It's capitalism. And not only is it capitalism, Denmark ranks as the 9th freest economy in the world. Sweden ranks 10th. The United States, we rank 25th. Scandinavia has freer markets than America. So, if Scandinavia isn't socialist, what is socialism? And why does every actual socialist country collapse into poverty, starvation, and mass immigration? That's what we're covering today. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint. Today, I'm going to dismantle every lie you've been told about socialism, and I'll show you why socialism can't work. Not because of bad people or corrupt leaders, but because of basic economics. All right, let's get into it. Let's start with the Scandinavia myth, because this is the foundation of the entire democratic socialism argument. If I can prove that Scandinavia isn't socialist, and that it actually tried socialism and abandoned it after failure, the entire argument collapses. First, economic freedom rankings. The Heritage Foundation publishes an annual index of economic freedom, measuring how free market each country is. Denmark scores 77.6, ranking 9th in the world. Sweden scores 77.5, ranking 10th. Norway ranks 28th. The United States ranks 25th. Let that sink in. The countries American socialists call socialist have freer markets than the United States. Second, there's no minimum wage law in Scandinavia. None. Not in Denmark, not in Sweden, not in Norway, not in Finland, not in Iceland. Zero minimum wage laws. How do wages work then? Union negotiation. About 67% of Danish workers are in unions. In Sweden, 65%. Union density in the United States, 9.9%. Scandinavian wages are set through industry-level collective bargaining between unions and employers, not government mandate. That's the opposite of socialist central planning. Third, Scandinavia tried actual socialism in the 1970s and 1980s, and it nearly destroyed their economies. Let me walk you through Sweden's experiment because it's the clearest example. From 1870 to 1970, Sweden grew faster than almost any developed country except Japan. By 1950, Sweden was the 4th richest country in the world and had the 3rd freest economy. Public spending was below 20% of GDP, lower than the United States. Taxes as a share of GDP were lower than America's. The top marginal tax rate was 20 percentage points lower than the US rate. Sweden was a capitalist success story. Then, in the 1970s, Sweden went socialist. Government spending doubled from 31% of GDP in 1960 to 60% of GDP in 1980. They implemented higher taxes, increased regulations, and price controls. The result? Sweden went from 10% richer than the average G7 country in 1970 to 10% poorer than the G7 by 1995. Not a single net private sector job was created during the entire period. Inflation wiped out wage increases, investment collapsed, productivity stagnated, companies fled the country, IKEA moved its headquarters to the Netherlands, steel, shipbuilding, textile, and mining industries collapsed by the late 1970s. By the 1990s, Sweden faced an economic crisis that forced them to retreat from socialism. They cut public spending from over 60% of GDP to below 50%. They reduced benefits in social security systems. They privatized 19 state-owned companies. They abolished wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, and estate taxes. They deregulated markets. They reformed the pension system from defined benefits to defined contributions with private accounts. They introduced a school voucher system allowing private schools. They allowed private providers in healthcare, elder care, and education. Now about 20% of welfare services are privately provided. Kjell-Olof Feldt was Sweden's Social Democratic Minister of Finance from 1983 to 1990. He helped architect Sweden's return to capitalism. And here's what he said: what we believed in as young socialists simply turned out to be impossible in practice. That's a socialist admitting socialism doesn't work. So, what is Scandinavia today? It's free market capitalism with an extensive welfare state funded by high taxes on everyone, not just the rich. And that's the part American socialists don't tell you. The total tax burden in Denmark is 45.9% of GDP. In Sweden, 41.4%. In Finland, 43.4%. In the United States, 27%. To match Scandinavian spending, America would need to increase tax collection by about $3 to $4 trillion annually. And here's who would pay: the middle class. Denmark applies its top marginal tax rate to earnings just 1.2 times the national average wage. The US applies its top rate only to earnings 8.5 times the national average. In America, if you make $60,000 and the average wage is $60,000, you're in a low bracket. In Denmark, you'd be in the top bracket. Sweden's tax system is one of the least progressive in the OECD. The rich don't pay a much bigger share than the middle class. And then there's the VAT, the value-added tax, which is a national sales tax. Denmark's VAT is 25%. Sweden's is 25%. Norway's is 25%. The United States has no federal VAT, only state and local sales taxes averaging about 7.5%. A VAT is regressive. It hits the poor and middle class hardest because they spend a larger share of their income on consumption. Here's another thing Scandinavian countries don't have: wealth taxes. Sweden abolished its wealth tax in 2007. Norway abolished its inheritance tax. Denmark did the same in the 1990s. Finland abolished its wealth tax in 2006. Why? Because they tried them and they failed. Wealthy people moved to tax havens. Businesses relocated. Revenue was far below projections. The taxes were expensive to administer and easy to evade. France tried a 75% super tax on high earners from 2012 to 2015. It caused an exodus of wealthy individuals, including actor Gerard Depardieu, who renounced his French citizenship. The tax raised minimal revenue and was abolished after 3 years. So here's the reality: Scandinavia is not socialist, it's capitalist. It has freer markets than America in many areas. It tried socialism in the 1970s and 1980s and rolled it back after near disaster. And the generous welfare programs are funded by taxing everyone heavily, especially the middle class, through income taxes and a 25% sales tax, not by soaking the rich. Now let's look at a country that actually implemented socialism: Venezuela. In the 1970s, Venezuela was the richest country in South America. By 1950, it was the fourth wealthiest nation per capita in the world. In 1970, Venezuela's GDP per capita was higher than Spain, Greece, and Israel, only 13% lower than the United Kingdom. Venezuela was producing over 10% of the world's crude oil. The 1973 OPEC embargo quadrupled oil prices and added $10 billion to Venezuela's coffers. It was a prosperous, oil-rich democracy. Then, Hugo Chavez was elected in 1999 on a socialist platform. He pledged to use oil wealth to reduce poverty and inequality. And initially, it worked. Poverty fell by about 20% through oil revenue redistribution in the early 2000s. But here's what else happened. Chavez nationalized over 1,000 companies. Several million hectares of land were seized. Sectors affected included agriculture, banking, cement, iron, oil, manufacturing, retail, and telecommunications. Most of those nationalized businesses have since closed. The ones still operating work at fractions of their peak output. In 2002 and 2003, there was a major strike in the oil industry. Chavez responded by firing thousands of experienced workers from the state oil company. He gutted the company of technical expertise. This had a devastating long-term impact. Oil production peaked around 3 million barrels per day in 2000. By 2014, it had fallen to 2.4 million barrels per day. Today, estimates put it around 500,000 to 700,000 barrels per day, an 85% collapse. Chavez imposed capital controls in 2003, creating a Byzantine system where there was an official subsidized dollar rate and a black market rate. This spawned an entire industry of politically connected insiders lobbying for subsidized dollars to resell on the black market. Corruption exploded. He also implemented price controls to make goods affordable. The result? Shortages. When you cap the price of bread below the cost of production, bakers stopped making bread. By the mid 2000s, Venezuelans were standing in lines for hours to buy basic goods, and the shelves were often empty. Hugo Chavez died in 2013. Nicolas Maduro succeeded him and pledged to continue Chavez's policies. Then, in 2014, global oil prices collapsed. Venezuela, which had become 98% dependent on oil exports, faced catastrophe. And here's the critical point. The economic collapse began before major US sanctions. In 2016, Venezuela officially entered hyperinflation, defined as monthly inflation exceeding 50% for 30 consecutive days. The IMF estimated 500% inflation and a 10% GDP contraction that year. By 2017, inflation hit 4,000%. In 2018, it reached 130,000%. In 2019, at the peak, inflation hit 300,000%. Prices were doubling multiple times per day. Let me show you what this did to ordinary people. In 2017, 75% of Venezuelans lost an average of 8 kilograms, about 19 pounds, due to food shortages. By 2018, the average Venezuelan had lost 19 kilograms over 2 years. The monthly average income was about $250, but it couldn't cover even half the cost of basic groceries. GDP collapsed by 70% to 80% from 2014 to 2021. This is described as the single largest economic collapse outside of war in at least 45 years. It's worse than the US Great Depression. It's worse than the 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War economy. Venezuela's GDP per capita fell from $12,700 in 2012 to $1,600 in 2020. An 88% decline. The poverty rate exploded. By 2021, 94.5% of Venezuelans were living in poverty. 76.6% were in extreme poverty, the highest rate ever recorded in any country. People couldn't afford the basic monthly food basket. Unemployment hit 40%. About 60% of the economically active population worked in the informal sector. And then there's the emigration. Between 2014 and 2025, 7 to 8 million Venezuelans fled the country. That's approximately 25% to 30% of the entire population. It's one of the largest migration crises in the Western Hemisphere's history. Over 3 million went to Colombia alone. Venezuelans walked for weeks across borders, carrying children, fleeing starvation. Now, socialism defenders will say US sanctions caused this. But that's a lie. Let's look at the timeline. Venezuela's economic collapse and hyperinflation began in 2014 to 2016. Major US oil sanctions weren't imposed until 2019, after the catastrophe was already well underway. The collapse was caused by nationalization, price controls, currency controls, money printing, corruption, and the loss of technical expertise in the oil industry. Sanctions made things worse, but they didn't cause the collapse. This is what socialism looks like in practice. And Venezuela isn't an outlier. It's the pattern. The Soviet Union, the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 1933, killed between 5 and 7 million people. It was caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture. The state seized grain and exported it while Ukrainians starved to death. Many historians consider it genocide. Bread lines were the defining image of the Soviet Union. Despite full employment, unemployment was illegal, stores had empty shelves. People stood in lines for hours to buy basic goods. Why? Because central planning couldn't match supply with demand. The economic calculation problem, which we'll get to. At the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, GDP per capita was about $9,000. Western Europe's was over $20,000. The Soviet Union, despite massive natural resources, fell further behind the West every decade. Technology consistently lagged 5 to 10 years behind. They couldn't compete in the computer revolution. Consumer goods were primitive. And when the Berlin Wall fell, we discovered the truth. It was all a facade. China, under Mao Zedong, the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 1962 killed between 30 and 45 million people. Most estimates say 45 million. It's the largest famine in human history. Mao's policies? Forced collectivization, backyard steel furnaces, insane production quotas, destroyed agriculture. People were starving while party officials dined well. Before 1978, the vast majority of Chinese lived in extreme poverty. The economy stagnated. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 devastated what was left. By Mao's death in 1976, China was near collapse. Then, Deng Xiaoping took over and implemented market reforms in 1978. Special economic zones introduced capitalism. Private property rights expanded. Foreign investment was welcomed. And what happened? China lifted 800 million people out of poverty, the largest poverty reduction in human history. Extreme poverty in China went from 88% in 1981 to less than 1% in 2015. This happened after abandoning socialism, not because of it. Cuba. It's been under communist rule since 1959. The average monthly salary today is $30 to $50. Ration books are still used for basic goods. Rationing has been in place since 1962, over 60 years. Food shortages are chronic. Medicine shortages are severe. Infrastructure is crumbling. The internet is heavily restricted. Political repression is ongoing. Over 2 million Cubans, out of a population of 11 million, have fled. Cubans risk their lives on rafts to escape. That tells you everything you need to know. And then there's the most perfect experiment in history. East Germany versus West Germany. Same people, same culture, same history. Divided after World War II. East Germany went communist with Soviet-style central planning. West Germany went capitalist with free markets. By 1989, West Germany's GDP per capita was 3 times higher than East Germany's. West Germany was prosperous and modern. East Germany had decrepit infrastructure and shortages. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961 to stop East Germans from fleeing to the West. 3.5 million had already left. The wall had shoot-to-kill orders. About 140 people were killed trying to escape. When the wall fell in November 1989, East Germany's economy was exposed as a disaster. It required massive West German subsidies to rebuild. Same people, different systems, drastically different outcomes. So, why does socialism fail every single time? It's not bad people. It's not corruption, though corruption is worse under socialism because there's no accountability. It's economics. Specifically, it's the economic calculation problem identified by economist Ludwig von Mises. Here's how it works. In a market economy, prices signal scarcity and value. If bread is scarce, the price rises. That signals bakers to make more bread and consumers to buy less. Prices coordinate millions of decisions by individuals and businesses. Profit and loss guide entrepreneurs toward productive activities. It's constant adjustment to changing conditions. Under socialism, the state owns the means of production. There are no markets for capital goods. Without markets, there are no genuine prices. Without prices, central planners can't calculate costs and benefits. They don't know what to produce, how much to produce, or for whom. The result is massive misallocation of resources, shortages, and surpluses. The Soviet Union overproduced steel and underproduced consumer goods because planners had no way to know what people actually wanted. Even with computers, this problem is unsolvable. Planners would need to track millions of products, billions of preferences, constantly changing conditions. It's impossible. The information doesn't exist in one place, it's distributed across millions of minds. Prices aggregate that information. Central planning cannot. Then there's the innovation problem. In capitalism, innovation is rewarded with profits. Entrepreneurs risk capital for potential gains. Successful innovations spread rapidly through competition. Under socialism, there's no profit motive. State-owned enterprises don't face competition. Bureaucrats make decisions, not entrepreneurs. There's no incentive to innovate because you can't profit personally. There's no punishment for failure because the state covers losses. Established interests resist change. Political considerations override economic ones. The result? Technology lags, consumer goods are scarce and low quality, and the economy stagnates. The Soviet Union proved this. Consumer electronics were 10 to 20 years behind the West. Color TVs arrived late and were poor quality. There were no personal computers for citizens, only state use. Telephones were scarce with waiting lists of years. Soviet automobiles used decades-old designs and were poor quality. The USSR couldn't compete in the microchip revolution. The information technology gap became unbridgeable. There was no Soviet equivalent of Silicon Valley, no personal computer revolution, no entrepreneurial tech companies. And here's the paradox that stumps people. The USSR boasted full employment, unemployment was illegal, yet stores had chronic shortages and long lines for basic goods. How does that happen? Because jobs were allocated by central planners, not markets. Many jobs were unnecessary or unproductive. The Soviet saying was, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. Production focused on meeting quotas, not satisfying consumers. Factories produced tons of steel to meet targets, but didn't care if anyone wanted the steel. There were no price signals to correct shortages or surpluses. Workers didn't care about quality because they were paid regardless. Meanwhile, warehouses filled with unsold goods no one wanted, and stores had empty shelves of goods everyone needed. Now let's address one more myth, that social programs equal socialism. This is where people get confused. Social Security, Medicare, public schools, police, fire departments, roads, these are not socialism. Socialism is defined as state ownership of the means of production, the government owning and controlling businesses and industry, central planning replacing markets, no private property and productive capital. Social programs are government-provided services funded by taxes that operate within a capitalist economy. The private sector generates wealth, and the government redistributes some of it. Every developed country has social programs, including very capitalist ones. Socialism is about who owns the economy, not whether the government provides services. If the US government owned Amazon, Walmart, Apple, and ran all farms and factories, that would be socialism. Social Security is insurance. Medicare is insurance for the elderly. These are not socialism. You can have capitalism with a generous welfare state. That's the Nordic model. But you can't have socialism without state ownership. So let's talk about capitalism's actual record, because this gets ignored. In 1820, 90% of the world lived in extreme poverty. By 2015, only 10% lived in extreme poverty. This is the greatest achievement in human history. What changed? The spread of capitalism, industrialization, trade, and private property rights. China lifted 800 million people from poverty after adopting markets in 1978. India's poverty rate fell from 50% in 1980 to 20% in 2015 after economic liberalization in 1991. The dramatic acceleration in global poverty reduction from 1980 to 2015 coincides with the fall of communism, the rise of globalization, and the spread of markets. Life expectancy globally went from 31 years in 1900 to 73 years in 2020. Capitalism funded the medical research and healthcare improvements. Infant mortality plummeted, diseases were eradicated or brought under control by pharmaceutical companies driven by profit. Access to clean water and sanitation improved massively. These infrastructure improvements were built by prosperous capitalist economies. And let's talk about inequality, because this is where the propaganda is most effective. The lie is that socialism creates equality and capitalism creates inequality. The reality is the opposite. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party elite, the nomenklatura, lived lavishly. They had access to special stores with imported goods, dachas, cars, luxury items. Ordinary citizens faced shortages and poverty. There was no middle class, just the elite and the masses. Political power replaced economic power, and there was no accountability. In Venezuela, the Chavista elite enriched themselves massively while the people starved. These Bolivarian oligarchs became billionaires during the crisis through currency arbitrage and corruption. Ministers accumulated hundreds of millions, while citizens lost an average of 19 kilograms. In Cuba, the Castro family is worth hundreds of millions. Party officials have access to goods and luxury items. Ordinary Cubans make $30 to $50 per month and are on rations. In North Korea, the Kim dynasty lives in extreme luxury. Yachts, imported cognac, gourmet food, while the population faces starvation. During China's Great Leap Forward, 45 million ordinary Chinese died while party officials had access to food. The pattern is universal. Socialist countries show extreme inequality between the political elite and everyone else. There's no middle class. Political power equals economic privilege. Corruption is rampant because there's no market discipline. The elite's power is unchecked by markets or democracy. Capitalist countries have inequality, yes, but they have substantial middle classes. Social mobility is possible. Rule of law protects property rights. Consumer goods are accessible at many price points. And critically, the poor in capitalist countries live better than the middle class in socialist countries. So let's bring this full circle. What is democratic socialism, as promoted by Bernie Sanders and AOC? Their actual policies, Medicare for all, free college, Green New Deal, wealth taxes, resemble Nordic social democracy, not socialism. They're proposing capitalism with higher taxes funding a more generous welfare state. But they misunderstand the Nordic model. Medicare for all would cost $32 to $40 trillion over 10 years. The Green New Deal would cost $51 to $93 trillion. To fund this, you'd need European-level taxation. That means increasing U.S. tax collection from 27% of GDP to 44% of GDP, an additional $3 to $4 trillion annually. You'd need a 25% VAT like Scandinavia. Top marginal rates would apply at much lower incomes. The middle class would bear the brunt, just like in Nordic countries. And remember, Nordic countries tried wealth taxes and abandoned them. Sweden abolished its wealth tax in 2007, inheritance tax in 2005. France tried a 75% super tax and repealed it in 2015 after it failed. These taxes cause capital flight, raise little revenue, and are expensive to administer. Here's the bottom line. Every socialist experiment has failed economically. Every major poverty reduction has come from capitalism. Scandinavia isn't socialist. It's free market capitalism with high taxes funding welfare, and they had to abandon their 1970s to 1980s socialist experiments to avoid economic ruin. The Venezuela collapse, the Soviet breadlines, the 45 million dead in Mao's famine, the Cuban ration books, the Berlin Wall built to keep people from fleeing. These aren't accidents. They're not anomalies. They're the inevitable result of socialism. Because when you abolish markets, you abolish prices. When you abolish prices, you abolish the information system that coordinates economic activity. And when you abolish private property, you abolish the profit motive that drives innovation. You're left with shortages, stagnation, and a political elite living in luxury while ordinary people starve. That's not a bug. It's a feature. Because without markets to discipline power, political power becomes absolute. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. Thank you for watching My Money Minute. If this breakdown of socialism's failures got you thinking about economic systems, let me know if you'd like more videos like this. If you got value from this video, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe or leave a like. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.